Chapter 11, Ghost of a Chance. As the score changed to 2-4, Carl saw all the joking around in the werewolf dugout change too. The werewolves were still up by 2, but Coach Powers was standing now, shouting and pointing furiously at his players on the field. The Scream team's momentum didn't last long. JD was up next. All the organs in JD's see-through body pointed between first and second as he slugged at a grounder. So the werewolf shortstop had been waiting. He easily snagged the ball, and JD was out at first. Top of the 5th inning started with the werewolf Francis at bat, a true power hitter. Coach Wyatt called for a curveball. JD's heart skipped a few beats as he got ready to throw. "Curveball!" Elf announced, sounding almost bored with being able to read JD like a book. Francis hit an easy single. With the next batter, a werewolf named Albert, JD took his time with the rosin bag. Remember that powder bag that makes his hand dry? He was about to toss the bag behind him again when he stopped and looked at his dust-covered fingers. Getting an idea, he dumped the white chalk all over his head. That white chalk, probably he's thinking, will make them not be able to think of what pitch he's going to throw, because they won't be able to see it. As the crowd laughed and the werewolves howled, JD wound up for the pitch. Elf said from the dugout. With JD covered in white dust, Elf couldn't tell from the beating of his heart which pitch would be anymore. JD delivered. The werewolf swung and connected with nothing but air. Strike 1. Now that Elf couldn't shout out the pitches, the werewolves would have to play to win. With 2 strikes, Albert finally managed to hit one of JD's pitches. It sailed to the outer field. Beck ran for it, looking like a scuba diver on land. He tripped and landed on his back, hard, and the ball bounced about 20 feet away. Beck kicked his legs in frustration. His flipper feet were like fans. Suddenly, he was gliding across the grass like a hovercraft on the water. "Woo!" he shouted, surprised. Beck zipped the ball and threw it to the infield, stopping Francis at third. In the 8th inning, Mike got the Scream team off to an amazing start. Elf growled at him from the mound, but Mike didn't cower. Instead, he followed Patsy's lead. He laughed. Remember I asked you that yesterday? Why does Patsy tell the batters to laugh when they're at bat? Mike switched from gripping the bat with his hands to using his tail. His stance seemed much more natural now. Elf put everything he had behind that pitch, but it wasn't enough. Mike whacked a double out of it. "Swamp Thing, that's some swing!" Virgil shouted to him. Maxwell strutted out to the field, swinging the bat. Unfortunately, he was headed towards the bathrooms. Carl turned him around, and the mummy made his way to home plate. Mummies can't see. Their eyes are closed, covered with the wrap. "I guess it's time for me to give up a little fashion for the team," Maxwell said before Carl trotted back to the dugout. Maxwell pushed aside some of the wrapping on his face so he could see better. Now, when the pitch came in, he nailed it. He hit another double and Mike raced home. Still covered in white powder from the rosin bag, JD went to bat. Elf stared at him for a second, trying to read inside of his body, but all he got was a grin and a laugh back from JD. "Ah!" JD told Elf with a grin. "I'm going to gobble up this pitch." And he did. He powered out a line drive that bounced to left field. He raced around the bases, Maxwell tore home, and then JD. Blam! Blam! When they crossed home plate, it put the Scream team someplace Carl never thought they'd be. They were in the lead. The score was 5-4. Harry Harrowell seemed just as shocked. If the Scream team could hold the werewolves and keep them from scoring another round, he announced, they could actually win the game. Chapter 12, Carl's Call. By the 9th inning, it was clear the Scream team might be a bunch of misfits, but many had shown they had something special to offer. They were all unique in their own way. Not me, though, Carl thought miserably. In his 2 other turns at bat, he'd hit a dribbler back to the mound and a hot shot to the hole in the hole fielded by the shortstop, both easy outs. And as catcher, he was anything but special. He kept dropping balls and flubbing throws. With only 1 more inning left, he still hadn't found a way to impress Coach Powers. He crouched down behind home plate and hoped he'd have a chance. JD fired off a fastball and Albert nailed this one, but it was a spitball straight to Mike's mitt. Ronnie, a big left-pawed werewolf, stormed out to the batting box. The infield was backed, so they moved back because they knew he could hit hard. JD delivered. Ronnie swung, hitting a ground ball half speed going down to second. Maxwell charged it, missed it with his mitt, but slung out a strip of sweaty cloth from his other arm, hooking the ball and pulling it back into him. The werewolf on third decided to stay put. "That's what I'm talking about," Virgil shouted. "No," Wyatt said. "That's what I'm talking about." With 2 outs, the bases were loaded with werewolves now. Just 1 more run and the score would be tied and the Scream team's lead would be gone. Elf pushed past Carl and stepped to the plate. "Watch this," he said to Carl with a wink. Elf tapped his bat on the dirt and then pointed it past out the outfield. "I can't believe it," Harry Harwell shouted. "Elf is saying he is ready to fill the mighty shoes of Wolfenstein." Carl couldn't believe what he was seeing either. Fill the shoes of Wolfenstein? No way. Not on my watch. JD waited for the call. Carl looked at the coaches. Wyatt touched his nose. Virgil tugged an ear. One wanted a fastball, the other wanted a changeup. They both kept tapping their nose and tugging an ear. Carl didn't know what to do. He didn't know what pitch to tell JD to throw. "Let's move along, Scream Team," the ump finally said. Carl panicked for a second, and then an idea for a throw popped into his head. They didn't have a signal for it, so he just shouted, "Ding dong!" and hoped JD would understand. Elf laughed. "Ding dong? I know JD is one, but the guy is on your team." After a quick nod to Carl, JD let loose. The pitch's path had a corkscrew in the center, just like when JD threw the ball at the Conundrum's doorbell. The back door slider curved just in time to cross over the plate. Elf got nothing but air. "Strike 1!" the umpire shouted. Elf grunted angrily and got back in his stance. JD tried the same pitch again. This time, Elf connected. A hard line drive going down the right field line. It was a foul ball by 2 feet. 2 strikes, 2 outs. Bases were loaded, and Carl knew everything was riding on this next throw. The ding-dong pitch had been taking some of the steam out of Elf's swagger, but now he was ready for it. You know what they say, 3rd time's the charm. Carl glanced at the coaches. They were still fighting over which pitch to call. Carl decided now it was time to give JD a chance. Carl had to let go of his pitching dream if he ever wanted the bigger one to come true. "Your choice, JD. You're the pitcher, you know best." JD was covered with white dust, but there was no hiding the deep red blush that covered his body. "Thanks, Carl," he said. The werewolf runners took their leads. JD set his mitt at the target zone and let loose. With any other hitter, the screaming fastball would have been a strike. But Elf was the best hitter in the league. He belted a long drive heading between center and right field to the bleachers. Bolt was there with his head down, helping a giant worm dig a hole. Well, he's not even paying attention. It's going right where Elf pointed, Harry Hairwell announced, and the werewolves will win. They will win. No, Carl thought. Not this time. He shouted, "Who knows what 145 divided by 234 is?" Bolt's head was still down, but his teacher's pet arm shot up. And still waving like he knew the answer, the ball ricocheted off Bolt's glove. It hit the ground and bounced towards first, heading high over Dennis's head at the two bleachers. Dennis closed his eyes. Two tiny wings popped up on his back, and he flapped them like a hummingbird. His flight lasted just a second, but long enough for him to snag the ball. He should have touched first, but instead he fired the ball blindly back to the infield towards second. It was yet another error for the Scream Team. The werewolf running from third to home slowed down for a joyride. Smiling, he watched as the ball was about to sail over Patsy's head. Patsy yanked off her arm that wore the mitt. She tossed them in the air, and the ball knocked into the mitt. The ball fell, and Eric rolled beneath it. The ball rebounded off of him and zinged towards home plate. By now, the werewolf runner heading home had seen the danger and picked up the speed. He was sprinting straight towards Carl, and so was the ball. Oh, Carl can't catch, and he's the catcher. Whew. It was up to Carl to make an impossible catch. "Poodle! Poodle! Poodle!" he heard Elf start to chant. A few werewolves were in the dugout, started making squeaking sounds to distract Carl. That did it. Carl couldn't take it anymore. He dropped his mitt and flipped up his catcher's mask. "Mr. and Mrs. Monster and all the monsters of the sea, the catcher is dumbstruck," Harry Hairwell shouted. "The Scream Team catcher is giving up."